Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the study. In the following 4 lectures, we'll study the teachings of government human resource management that is outlined in the governing principles of ancient China. We'll discuss a lot of the best practices and the theories behind them. The human resource management comes with a logical sequence. Okay, so we'll design our lectures based on the sequence as well. From an employer's perspective, before recruiting someone, the first thing to do is to observe the candidate and to test their abilities. Okay, so this is our focus today. Now, I suppose, I think before we dive into the teaching, let's agree on one thing first, right? Is that the ethical standard of government officials is absolutely crucial for the fate of the country. In our previous studies, we have discussed extensively why this is the case. And generally speaking, the ethical standard of the government officials has an impact on the way that they carry out their government duties and serve the people. However, knowing the importance of the officials doesn't necessarily mean that we understand them. Now, some of our viewers may argue, well, we do. Yes, we understand them. We have access to their resume, right? The list of their achievement. We have their LinkedIn page, and we can make a pretty good judgment on their quality. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. And as you will see in this lecture, knowing someone is both an art and a science, and is very methodical and complex. Now, let's ask an even more obvious question. Why do we have to bother to understand them in the first place? I'm afraid that the answer is actually much more, much deeper than a simple response, such as, because they're important. Oh, yes, they are. A lot of people are bothered by the idea that, they are misunderstood by others. Right? For example, as a Chinese person who has been living abroad for almost 20 years, such as myself, I can tell you that there is so much misunderstanding about the Chinese from certain part of the world. And many of our foreign friends have completely changed their perception about the Chinese after visiting China themselves. But still, this phenomenon of misunderstanding bothers a lot of people. Confucius made a very interesting comment about misunderstanding. He said he would not be afflicted when he was misunderstood, but he would be afflicted when he didn't know others. So this is very interesting. You see, being misunderstood is actually not something that we can control. The only thing that we have to do is to wait for people to know more about you, and it takes time. But the opposite, which is misunderstanding others, will lead to a series of trouble, such as inappropriate interaction, conflict, and so on. So from the government human resource perspective, okay, the only way to utilize human capital properly is by getting to know them. Now, if being understood by others is a passive thing, then understanding others is much more proactive action. So the question is, how do we achieve a good understanding of others? According to Lao Tzu, the precondition of that is to know oneself first. Now, he said, knowing others requires wisdom, but knowing oneself is enlightenment. So what does it mean? Well, you see, when we're judging others, we're doing so using our own knowledge and experience, right? In other words, we're trying to identify the features of another group of people through our own lens. For example, it's like looking through a binocular. Now, this binocular is subject to certain bias, and And this bias results in the misperception of the subject to a certain degree. So, in order to retrieve the true picture of the subject, scientists would have to understand the bias as accurate as possible and then adjust the observed pictures accordingly. And this is how we know that the world is not flat, even though it looks really flat, doesn't it? And it's the same idea in judging people, only that is much more difficult. This time, our observation suffers from many things, such as our personality, a limited experience, limited knowledge, and our own personal habit, etc. According to Lao Tzu, we must achieve certain degree of self-enlightenment first in order to understand our own personal traits and biases. After that, we can identify the true characteristics of other people more accurately. And when it comes to government recruitment, this is more crucial because it will help the leader and the recruitment function to identify the advantages and pitfall of the candidates better. Now, the second reason why it's important to understand the officials is that it will help the observer to self-cultivate. This observer can be either a leader or just a colleague. Now, understanding others is not for the purpose of calculating plots against others or setting someone up. No, it's for the purpose of offering appropriate assistance. But to do so, one must first cultivate oneself. When we observe others, and find the pros and cons, we think about whether or not we share the same thing. If there's something positive that we can learn from others, or something negative that we should avoid. And after that, we can offer help in a more targeted fashion. So, in the rest of this lecture, we'll demonstrate how the government can observe and identify talents based on what is called the 8 observations. Okay, the 8 observations. So, the first point of observation is a person's way of speech. Okay, let's have a look at that. Now, speech can be treated as a reflection of one's heart, right? It means that the speech has 2 aspects. One is the content, which is the surface, and the other is the way that it is delivered. I think it's easier to deal with the former, but the latter is more obscure. However, the latter is more revealing about the quality of a person. In Volume 1 of the Governing Principles, there's a very interesting description about the relationship between the speech and the mental activity of the person. It says if a person has a rebellious mentality, his speech will show shamefulness. In other words, he cannot hide the anxiety when talking. When a person is in doubt, his speech is incoherent and disorderly. This means that his logic is unclear and sometimes self-contradictory. If a person's mind is kind, he tends to speak little, and this is because his mind is calm and stable. In contrast, when a person becomes impetuous, often he speaks a lot. It also says that when a person tries to press false charge on someone, his speech tends to be without focus. And finally, when a person has lost integrity and does things against ethics, his words would be crooked without resolution. So this is the way to identify the potential mental activity of the speaker from the way that the words are delivered. Now, another way to understand this is by examining both the action and the speech. Okay, both the action and the speech. And more specifically, whether or not there is consistency between the content of the speech and real benefit. Confucius argued that there is a causal relationship between a person's morality and the effect of his speech. Okay, he said the speech of a virtuous person would definitely benefit others. He would not say something that brings harm. So we cannot say for sure that the person is definitely virtuous just because he has made a good speech. We have to be patient and wait and see what he does. Confucius also made similar comparison between, benevolence and courageousness. He said we can expect a benevolent person to be courageous, but a courageous person is not necessarily benevolent, and he could be quite violent. Of course, this principle can be applied in all social interaction and not limited to government recruitment. You might think that, oh gosh, this is complicated. I can't think of it. I can't think of all of those rules of observation when I listen to someone talking, right? Well, there's a rule of thumb, really. Confucius said, fine words. So here he goes. Fine words and an insinuating appearance are seldom associated with true virtue. So, in other words, when the speech is too decorated and the appearance too fawning, the chances are the heart of the speaker is less virtuous than it appears to be. This is especially relevant when the government select its officials, right? It suggests that electing someone purely based on beautiful speech is perhaps problematic. This requires the government recruiter to have high ethical and moral standard. The recruiter should not recommend somebody to a high position purely based on what the person says. Neither should the recruiter dismiss someone purely based on what the person says, or his speech, or her speech. Now, if this is the case, then everybody would be focusing not on cultivation and hard work, but on speech making. So what's the solution then? What is the solution? Well, when the government tries to determine the quality of a candidate, where is the focus? Well, the governing principle suggests that a superior person should strive to be discreet in speech, but quick in action. This is driven by the fact that government work is onerous. An official who truly cares about the quality of his work simply has very little time to make nice speeches, because his mind is on the job, not on speech making. In the business world, we can see a lot of great leaders, great entrepreneurs, who achieve breakthrough after breakthrough after breakthrough, but rarely a good talker. Although there are some who can do both very well, I think this recommendation still provides us with very good guidance on where we should focus. Now, we have established that speech making is not necessarily a good indicator of true benefit to the people. Therefore, if we know nothing about the person but just his speech, then we mustn't make a simple and naive inference between what one says and his true quality. But also the other side of the coin is that there might also be potential relationship between speech making and harm, and such relation may be amplified by the person's knowledge and position. What does this mean? Well, to understand this, we need to think about the mentality, of a speech maker. The chapter of Zhonglun of the governing principles reveals that a person who is a natural in making convincing speech and choosing delicate words is usually very perceptive about the details. So he or she can perceive the subtle change in the listener's mind and choose his wording very carefully. And he can be so good at it that he is able to get away from questioning and clear up the public doubt. If the speechmaker has certain private agenda that is not in the interest of the public, then his speech may be misleading. Now, if the public is able to distinguish between right and wrong, fact and false claim in his speech, then it's not a problem. This is, similar to the efficient market hypothesis in financial study, where people are assumed to have the perfect knowledge and the perfect ability to process information. However, the public usually don't have such skill to do so. And as we mentioned in the previous lecture, human mind suffers from behavioral biases, and people are not always able to make conclusions based on logic and principles. So for this reason, the public may be misled without knowing, without realizing. And such misleading information is anything but good, and it may cause harm to the public undetected. And furthermore, the degree of misleading may increase with the knowledge and the position of the speaker. This is because with more knowledge and higher position, the speaker is more capable to execute deceiving speech making. Now, we're not saying that this is definitely the case for every high official. This is nonetheless a logical deduction and a potentiality that must not be ignored. In fact, according to Zhong Lun, the ancient sages kings all paid enormous attention to the use of words and misinformation. In particular, they made regulation to deal with individuals who misinterpreted laws and confused the public, etc. And so this is not to be confused with blocking advice, by the way. Okay, they're not the same thing, right? And we should avoid swinging from one extreme to another. And the middle way is much healthier, I suppose. So we have now talked about the point of cautious from the listener's perspective. Okay, now how about the leader? Now we always say the leader should self-cultivate first before asking his subordinate to do the same. This is particularly relevant when it comes to understanding the style of speech-making of the officials. Okay, you see, the subordinates naturally follow the leader's preference. If the leader likes to see ethical conduct and moral behavior, then the subordinates would likely adjust their behavior to reflect the leader's preference. Now, one may argue that, they're probably faking it. Possibly. However, to elevate the general moral standard of the society as a whole, we have to start from somewhere. Even if the officials are faking it, it's better than abandoning morality altogether. When the people see the moral conduct of the government officials, they will appreciate it and start imitating, thereby improving the general atmosphere of social ethics. In contrast, if the leader likes flattering speech, then the subordinates would engage in decorative discourses, right? And the officials would compete making the best speeches, and so will the people in general. Now, what is more problematic is that it takes much more effort to harness a moral society than a speech-making society. Why? Because speech-making is easier, much easier than moral cultivation. So overall, we can see that the leader must be extremely cautious with what he or she prefers and be mindful about the effect on the rest of the society. So this is the first point of observation, speech-making. Now, the second point of observation is the result of a person's work versus his public image, which is the public opinion about him. Okay? Result versus opinion. Now, the governing principles recommend that when trying to understand an official, and of course, people in general, it is important to investigate the thing he does and how he does it. Well, this may sound obvious, right? But the significance is that it prevents the observer from being influenced by public opinion. Now, we say that public opinion can help us to form a certain understanding of a person, but it's not but it's only one of the many aspects. As we said before, human mind suffered from behavioral bias, and so are opinions, because opinions are generated by human mind. This is also the case when evaluating a government official. Confucius says, when the multitude hate a person, it is necessary to examine into the case. When the multitude like a person, it is necessary to examine into the case. So this means that investigating the result of an official's work can help the government recruiter or the leader to verify public opinion. And this applies to both positive opinions and negative opinions. So I guess the big question is, how? How should we do it? How should we perform the investigation? Well, the governing principles document a very interesting method, I think, that verifies public opinion about a person, and I think it's mentioned in the conversation between Zigong and Confucius. And as you know, Zigong was one of Confucius' top students. Okay, so this is very interesting. Listen to this. He asked Confucius, "What is your opinion about a person who is loved and praised by all the people of his neighborhood?" Confucius replied, "Well, I would not reach a conclusion so quickly." So the public opinion is a highly averaged opinion. Averaged opinion, right? Which masks many details. Confucius suggested what I would call a subsample analysis, using modern language, a subsample analysis. Now, this method splits the overall population into two subsamples. Okay, two subsamples. One consists of virtuous people only, and the other consists of unvirtuous people only. Okay, so virtuous people, unvirtuous people. Confucius would then observe the opinions given by these two subsamples separately. So what does that tell us? Well, for the official who received positive opinion on average, it is better that the virtuous commentators favor him and not the unvirtuous commentators. Likewise, for the officials who receive negative opinion on average, it is better that the unvirtuous commentators dislike him and not the virtuous commentators. Now, I think at this stage, our viewers would be able to perceive the rationale behind this arrangement or analysis, right? If an official is, disliked by unvirtuous commentators, then it must be the case that the conduct of the official is against the will of the unvirtuous commentators, which is likely to be selfish and harmful. One example, is the fight against corruption. If a government official initiated an anti-corruption policy, well, do you think this policy would be welcomed by the corrupted? Definitely not. The corrupted persons would try everything at their disposal to condemn, to bash this official, for obvious reason. But in contrast, virtuous commentators will welcome virtuous officials. Therefore, the government should be extremely critical when it comes to observing the quality of an official candidate based on public opinion. So, now, what is the rationale behind the investigation? What's the rationale? Well, the investigation of the actual results can help to verify public opinion and make more credible conclusion about a person, right? In volume 11 of the Governing Principles, there is an interesting story about investigation and official assessment. So, here's the story. When King Wei of the state of Qi, remember, state of Qi was one of the many states in the spring and autumn and Warring State period of China. So when King Wei of Qi was reviewing the performance of two governors, the governor of Jimo, a place called Jimo, okay? The governor of Jimo and the governor of Di. He found that there was a huge difference between the public opinion between the two and their actual performance. Right? There's a difference between the public opinion and the performance. The king had received a lot of bad words about the governor of Jimo. But when the investigator came back from Jimo, he reported that the agriculture was well developed. People there were able to feed their parents, feed their families, their children with sufficient surplus. And the local government was very efficient in business, and the security was well maintained. And it was revealed that the reason that the governor was condemned and accused was that he never liked to flatter those people close to the king. In other words, he refused to kiss ass. Now, what about the governor of Di? Well, the king received many compliments about this person, but the investigation showed that Di had many underdeveloped farmlands. People were poor, and the local authority was irresponsible to the security threat from the neighboring states. Now, as you can probably guess, it turns out that the governor of Di was very good at keeping a close relation with the king's assistants by channeling financial support. The king's assistants who accepted the financial support were simply not virtuous people, because they should never have done that. It was a serious conflict of interest, isn't it? Therefore, their opinions towards the governor were very biased. Now, I think this story is of great significance. It shows the importance to understand the motivation behind certain opinions and the necessity of investigation. So this can help the government and the general public to avoid losing the valuable officials, and being harmed by a few bad apples. Now, let's explore the necessity of investigation a bit further, shall we? Remember, we illustrated the method of investigation earlier using the subsampling technique. We said that it is important to distinguish which type of commentators express which type of opinion about a person. Virtuous commentators versus unvirtuous commentators. Now, we're now going to explain it further, right? From the perspective of the dynamics of faction composition. Okay, faction composition. According to volume 31 of the Governing Principles, if the government or the leader only uses the average opinion as the basis of recruitment decision making, then those with the support of a faction will be appointed, and those those who are not part of a faction will not be promoted. And there is nothing mysterious about that. It's a simple mathematics. But this simple mathematics might invite unintended consequences. So let's assume, right? Let's look at the simple model. Let's assume that we have someone with a high integrity and moral standard, and he or she is now being judged by a group of commentators. Now, from a pure mathematical perspective, the marketable social standard is a simple average of the opinions of all the commentators of the society or an organization. So in this group of commentators, there are obviously two kinds of opinions, right? Two kinds. One is favor and the other is objection. Favor, objection. Now, in our example, favor means that this person's integrity is recognized and promoted, and vice versa. Objection means that this person's virtue is denied, because we have already assumed that this person being judged is of high integrity and moral standard. Now, let's say in this universe of commentators, there are more objections than favors. More objections than favors. So the average opinion about the person is, of course, denial. Now, because we're playing God mode here, right? We know what's going on. So we know that the average opinion doesn't reflect the true quality of the person. Now, you may wonder what has caused such, this biased opinion. Well, this requires us to look at the composition of the majority. So in this universe, there are, in fact, 3 types of opinions. 3 types, not 2. Not yes or no, right? There are 3 types. The first type is the so-called genuine favor. And that is indicated by the green blocks with a smiling face. Okay? And the number is 4. So this is likely coming from ethical commentators who truly care about the public opinion and favor somebody with integrity. So that's the first type. The second type is so-called genuine objection, which is indicated by the yellow color blocks with dark, angry faces. Okay, dark, angry faces. And the number is 2. There's only 2 of them. So these commentators may simply disagree with certain policies put forth by this person, or they may have misinterpreted his integrity. But in any case, these 2 commentators are doing their jobs and expressing a genuine view. Now, the third type is the so-called objection by dishonest interest group. Okay, objection by dishonest interest group, which is indicated by the yellow color blocks with red angry faces. And the number is 9. Okay, 9. Now, remember, we have already assumed that our candidate is of high integrity, so we can imagine that this integrity may hurt the interests of certain unethical members of commentators. And the consequence is that when the unethical members or commentators band together and form the majority, negative opinions will take the upper hand. So in this case, even without counting for the genuine objections, which is 2, the number of objections by dishonest interest group still outweighs the genuine favors, which clearly results in non-recruitment of this person. The governing principle concludes that when the leader only takes a person accepted by marketable social standard as a wise person, and mistakes another defamed by the society as an unworthy person, ministers with undeserved reputation will be employed, and the days will become more tumultuous, and the survivability of the government or the country will be numbered. Now, of course, our example is highly simplified, and it is just one special case of many possibilities. But, it does show the potential problems of blindly relying on the average opinions. And this again shows the necessity of the observation of the result of the work. In the biography of Confucius, there is a story about Confucius' investigation into the performance of the town master Zilu. Okay, so after Confucius crossed the border into the town, he looked around and he said, wow, it seems that Zilu respects the people and has achieved sincereness in his governing. And after he entered into the center of the town, he said, well, it seems that Zilu is a trustworthy governor. And his student Zigong was very puzzled, as much as we are, I suppose, and asked Confucius, Master, we haven't met Zilu yet since we got here, but you've praised him multiple times. What's the reason? Confucius replied, well, when we first crossed the border, I saw the farmlands were well cultivated and very organized. The irrigation ditches are deep, and this shows that Zilu treat the people with respect and sincereness, so that the people are willing to put in the effort to achieve perfection in their work. And when we reach the town center, the walls and buildings are properly built, and the green belt is tidy, This also shows that Zilu is trustworthy and the people are not willing to shirk. Now we must know that in the past, all of these public infrastructure projects were done by a corvée. So the high quality of work shows that people were not reluctant to work, but very motivated. And they would be motivated only by a virtuous leader who respect them. And so this is why Confucius was able to reach such conclusion based on investigation of the work without even having to see the person. Now, the third point of observation is a person's behavior. A person's behavior. Now, there is a Chinese saying that goes, "It's better to observe the performance than listening to words. It is even better to observe the behavior than performance." Now, this is because behavior is more detailed. While the performance is the end result, behavior is the process, and it reflects how a person thinks. So it's more revealing about the quality of a person. Now, in the governing principles, there is a specific chapter that provides guidance on what is supposed to be good or bad behavior. And the guidance focuses very much on the ethics and the mentality of the officials. So we use it as a framework for our discussion. Okay? Now, there are roughly 6 good behaviors and 6 bad behaviors. The requirement of these good behaviors are so high that a candidate is deemed to be qualified for governmental work even if he or she only presents 1 good behavior. And likewise, the 6 bad behaviors point to the core of moral degeneration. So even if only one of these bad behaviors is found, the person is deemed to be disqualified for governmental work. Okay? Now, so let's jump right in and have a look. The first of the good behaviors documented is that a person has great foresight and takes preventative measures. Such a person is a sagely minister. So this type of officials is able to stop the problem before it materializes. So an official who is able to do this must not only be knowledgeable with technical know-how, but also be willing to take the responsibility and the potential blame. Let's think about this for a while. You see, before a problem is materialized, the situation usually seems normal and calm, right? The majority of the people may not be able to detect the violent current underneath the seemingly calm surface, and only a few people could see it through. Now, at this point, those who detect the potential problem may have to make changes based on their expectation and theoretical deduction. This is a very important point here, and allow me to repeat this. Changes may have to be made only based on expectation and theoretical deduction. You see, expectation is different from fact in the sense that it can only be proved correct once it actually happens. However, if the expectation points to some kind of severe problems, the realization of the expectation is disastrous. It's too costly. When we try to make a forecast of what is going to happen in the future, the governing principles remind us about the principles of the nature and morality, right? If things are against the natural principle, either the physical principle or moral principle, things will go wrong. So a virtuous or sagely minister is able to apply the principle and boldly make recommendation to the leader to prevent disasters. Now, sometimes the ministers who prevent disasters get blamed on the ground that the measures taken may have been tougher than necessary. Now we can see a few comments like this during the dealing with the pandemic or other social crisis. However, these comments themselves are also expectations by nature, aren't they? Well, they might be true, yes, but they might not be true. But a sagely minister is not willing to sacrifice the well-being of the society simply by avoiding complaint and then do nothing. We say that this type of good behavior will protect the government. So what do we mean by that? Protect the government. It means that a government would only be protected if the social well-being is protected. A government that does nothing in order to avoid complaint is in fact exposed to more complaint when the problem is materialized. So that's the first good behavior. The second good behavior says, modest and diligent, supports the good and eradicates the evil. Such a person is a good minister. So according to the governing principle, this means that the minister is able to encourage the self-cultivation of the leader. Okay, the self-cultivation of the leader. When the leader performs well and practices morality, he can encourage the leader and guide the leader to do better. But when the leader shows sign of abandoning morality, he's able to point it out in an appropriate way and guide the leader to follow the moral principles. Now we can see that this requires two things. One is obviously courage, and the other is wisdom. It requires courage for obvious reasons. A good minister should not only worry about his own job, but also the well-being of the people in general. In fact, his concern about the people outweighs the concern of his own. And it also requires wisdom because let's face it, nobody's perfect, including the leader. Right? So if a good advice is made at the wrong time or in an inappropriate manner, it simply may not be accepted. Although you can blame the leader any way you like, but it is the people who suffers from bad governance in the end. Therefore, a good minister is not only brave enough to advise, but also clever enough to make sure that his advice achieves the maximum effect. Now, the third good behavior says hardworking and never tired of recommending good people to work for the government. Such a person is a loyal minister. So this points to the crucial difference between an able minister and a loyal minister. Okay, a person may be very skillful and highly intelligent. He may make many contributions to the government, but the contribution of one person is, after all, limited. Okay, and it would be a lot better if the government or the leader is supported by many able ministers. So it is the responsibility of the ministers to be open-minded and make appropriate recruitment recommendations to the government. However, it is not uncommon for an able minister, or anyone for that matter, to be jealous about other intelligent people. And there are many motivations. For example, concern of being overshadowed, or the concern of having to share certain resources, etc. Now, this is part of human habit in everyday life, but is a huge impediment to governance. Through the work of government, a good official can bring enormous benefit to the people's life. Therefore, the leader should be very sensitive to this type of behavior and encourage the officials to make good referrals. The fourth good behavior is, it says, perceptive about success and failure, turns misfortune into good fortune. Such a person is a wise minister. Now, this is fairly self-explanatory, and it emphasizes the fact that a minister is able to reverse bad situation and make timely remedy to problems. Now, more importantly, a minister will share the burden of the leader so as to allow the leader to engage in other important matters. Now, of course, if someone is able to reverse the bad situation, then he or she is always a wise minister. But this doesn't mean that we expect a minister to solve all the problems by himself. He needs to be able to delegate, to plan, to organize, and most importantly, never run away from responsibility. That's the key. The opposite, of course, is where a minister only enjoys the glory with the leader, but takes no responsibility when things go south. The next good behavior says, honest and scrupulous in his dealing, performs official duties with integrity. Such a person is an honourable minister. So this behavior emphasizes self-discipline of the officials, in particular maintaining integrity and avoiding conflict of interest. I know that we're talking about it under the context of country governance, but let me switch gear and talk about corporate governance for a minute, if I may. I mean, after all, right, the governing principles can be applied in various settings and scenarios. In corporate governance, one of the central tasks of the board of directors is to design a set of policies that align the interest between the management team and the shareholders. The shareholders are referred to as the principals, and the managers are referred to as the agents. So when the agents carry out activities that benefit themselves but at the expense of the principals, we have what is called an agency problem. Now, if we look at the annual report of any public company, we often find extensive corporate governance policies that try to reduce such conflict of interest. Now, for example, the top managers are prohibited to sell their company shares for a period of time, and their remuneration is linked to share price performances, etc. But what we also found is that the top managers are very creative in exploiting the loopholes of corporate governance policies. The same problem applies to government officials. And in this case, they are the agent, right? And the people are the principals. So from the previous lectures, we know that, as compared to policies and regulations, which are nonetheless very important, it is way better to have a morally superior officials who self-regulate and align their interests with that of the people. And so this can only be achieved through proper education. Okay, the last good behavior says upright and outspoken, unafraid to point out the faults of his government. Such a person is a forthright minister. Now, this behavior is slightly different from the second one. Remember, the second one requires that the officials should do two things: point out the problem of the leader and guide the leader to make good. But this particular behavior only focuses on the part of pointing out the problem. So although this is not as good as the second one, this is also a very desirable behavior. For example, as I mentioned before, Emperor Taizong of Tang Dynasty recruited dedicated officials whose only job was to point out his mistake. Right? Also, King Huan of Qi, of the state of Qi, also welcomed criticism from the officials and treated them with the highest respect. Now, we must make a note of caution about this behavior number 6. See, pointing out the fault of Pointing out the fault of the government is not the same as irresponsible accusation. Okay, and the critic must perform diligent investigation into the problem and make sure that the criticism is valuable and helpful. If the criticism is not backed by fact and purely motivated by factionalism or personal reason, and it would cause enormous confusion to the public and harm the society. This is simply because, as we have mentioned before, the public doesn't necessarily have the full sets of information to make the best judgment. It's not entirely impossible for certain officials to abuse this good behavior, right, and mislead the public. Therefore, this behavior number 6 requires extremely high moral standard of the officials in executing his responsibility. Now, there are also 6 evil behaviors or bad behaviors of officials, which the leader should be aware of and avoid at all cost, because one bad behavior will cause tremendous damage to the integrity of the government and will confuse right and wrong, not to say all 6 of them. Okay. So the first evil behavior says being content with an official's salary but having no interest in his job. Such a person is an incompetent minister. Now, the value of a person, okay, the value of a person at a place of work comes from teamwork, efficiency, and independent thinking, etc. And this is particularly useful when it comes to government work, because when the official adds value to his job, the benefit will be spread among the wider population. Right? For example, detection of environmental hazard, improvement of public service quality, solution to improve police response time, etc. All of these will be applied nationwide. But this requires initiatives of the officials. If the official is only interested in the security and financial reward provided by the job and takes no initiatives to improve people's lives, then he's not only wasting the official's salary, which is taxpayers' money, but causing enormous opportunity cost. This is because someone else, could have replaced him and make more contribution to the country and the general public. So this is actually very costly to the country. And what is more problematic is that the official present the so-called herding behavior at the place of work. Right? This means that official goes with the crowd's opinion and have very limited critical thinking. This may be caused by lacking of initiatives or a concern of being different and losing his position. But in any event, this type of behavior shows incompetence as a government official. The second evil behavior says flatters effusively to placate his superiors. Such is a flattering minister. Now, based on the principle of ancient governance, it's safe to say that this type of behavior is more harmful than the previous one. When an official indiscriminately agrees with the leader, without any consideration of righteousness, the leader receives no valuable advice. So in this case, the official may be, amplifying the negative consequence caused by bad decisions. Our viewers now may recall some of the discussions in the governing principles which specifically explain the relationship between the existence of flattery ministers and the foreseeable downfall of a country. Okay, quite a lot of discussion in the previous lectures. So that was the second one. Now, the third evil behavior says, talks cleverly in the ingratiating manner and is jealous of good and able people. Such a person is a treacherous minister. So in this case, the official is not only flattery, but also jealous of talents. Now, if we politely call an official presenting behavior number 2 a soft person, then this number 3 would make an official absolute evil. This is because, this time the official is very deceiving. The governing principles explain that this type of official are usually treacherous on the inside, but present a cautious appearance on the outside. They use nice words and speeches to cover their true intention. And if there's someone that they find beneficial to recruit and bring on board with them, in their recommendation, they tend to exaggerate the good part and hide the downside because they like them, right? Now, if there's someone that they don't like, they would exaggerate the downside and hide the virtue. Also, because this type of officials are jealous of the real talent, the candidate that they recommend or reject do not indicate contribution or threat to the governing, but largely depending on their own private agenda. And furthermore, because they treat their own agenda as more important over the public interest, the government's agenda will likely be impeded or even completely blocked. Now, sometimes, indeed, this treacherous official is difficult to get rid of because they know the way to hide their intention and win the heart of the leader. Now, there's a story about King Gong of Chu, the state of Chu, and two of his officials called Guansu and Shenhoubo. All right, there's quite a few names. So the king is called Gong, King Gong of Chu, and two officials, Guansu and Shenhoubo. So on his deathbed, King Gong summoned his assistant and told him to dismiss Shenhoubo from his position, but promote Guansu. He said, I have always found Guansu very annoying. He always nudged me about my conduct and ethics. But I know, deep down, he's a great man. Although I haven't given him a high position, I want you to grant him with great power and responsibility after I die. Shenhoubo, on the other hand, is a joyful person to be with. He indulges me to do whatever I want and makes me feel good about myself, but I know he makes no contribution to the government. I just never had the determination to leave him. So this is a true story, and I dare to think that many of us may be able to relate to various degrees. Something to think about. The fourth evil conduct, or behavior, rather, says that talks artfully and sow discord among people. Such a person is a slandering minister. The governing principle explained that this type of officials are very intelligent, smart enough to use decorative words and lobby about their idea. Because they place benefit above ethics, sometimes in order to achieve their objectives, it requires them to create conflict and confrontation among government members. You see, the success and the efficiency of the government requires not only skills, but also solidarity among the officials. But the existence of slandering officials is a threat to solidarity. The next evil behavior says dictatorial and arbitrary and forms divisive factions to advance his personal interests. Such a person is a crooked minister. So this type of ministers possess enormous power and make decisions not based on the proper procedure or principles, but on personal taste. And I guess throughout the history, we often find these officials forming powerful factions within the government, and sometimes they are more powerful than the leader, and they can even manipulate the leader's order at their own convenience. The last type of evil behavior says works behind the scenes and stirs up trouble and unrest. Such a person is a vicious minister. Now we can say that the last type of official are the worst of the worst. And the governing principles explain that these officials deliberately mislead mislead the leaders and lead the government into a trap of unrighteous conduct, such as war. They also make the leader confused between right and wrong, and making the leader losing his reputation in the world. So the above is the behavior observation of the officials. Now, the fourth point of observation is the official circle of friends. Okay, circle of friends. Now, this is interesting because, under normal setting, right, the normal setting of ministers of private organizations, or at least, the recruitment of private organizations, for example, we don't normally think about, what kinds of people the candidate makes friends with, right? I mean, after all, it's a private matter that nobody is really obliged to talk about under normal circumstances. However, when it comes to government work, it may become relevant because it is the entire nation at stake. So why are friends important? Well, the short answer is you are who you make friends with, right? For example, Xunzi described the situation as follows. He said, when the peng vine, peng is a type of plant, okay? So when the peng vine grows among hemp plants, it goes up straight without being stood upright. Okay, so this type of plant it grows in the wetland, and the shape of it depends on the shape of the surrounding plants. Okay, so it goes with them. So this is a metaphor that describes how the circle of friends can shape a person's character. Now, you might ask, what if a person is intelligent and has already built a good foundation and formed good characteristics? Well, it's still desirable to choose friends carefully because the influence of a friend is subtle and powerful. Subtle and powerful. This is the view documented in volume 38 of the Governing Principles. It says that even a person with good character and the ability to discern right from wrong must seek virtuous teachers to guide him. He should spend time with friends of virtue and benevolence. Virtuous friends showed him about faithfulness, right? Faithfulness, trustworthiness, respectfulness, and forbearance. This kind of learning is natural and effortless because it is easier to learn by seeing demonstration. Now, in contrast, making friends of, let's say, deception, dishonesty, and greediness exposes the person to the danger of deteriorating personal quality. As he's demonstrated with these behaviors and thoughts for long enough, he would find himself imitating these traits to perfection. Also, the influence of the circle of friends is compared to smell, right? Smell. For example, if you walk into a shop of fragrance, like the ground floor of one of those department stores where they sell ladies' perfume, our clothes will smell like fragrance, right? But if we walk into a shop of salted fish, our clothes will smell fishy. But the problem is, after being in the shop for long enough, we become unable to tell the difference. This is because we are getting used to it. So this is the same effect of friends. For this reason, Confucius made a simple recommendation, right, when choosing friends, which is always choose friends with superior morality. Superior morality. This is because morally superior friends can demonstrate honesty, respect, filiality, hardworking, and influence us. Now, friends have a special place in our morality because they set a benchmark, right? And what is more, we have a strong feeling about this benchmark because we see our friends almost every day and we know them very well. If it's somebody we don't know, we might not have a strong feeling or incentive to follow. Confucius pointed out that it is necessary to have a constant reminder, like a morally superior friend, because without a reminder, we tend to lose discipline. And if we do, we lose our footing in the society. Now, let me point out an important thing before we move on. All friends are equal. Okay, all friends are equal. There's no such thing as one friend is superior than another. No. It certainly doesn't mean that we treat friends differently based on their level of morality. Confucius once said, when I walk along with two other people, they may serve me as my teachers. I will select their good qualities and follow them, and their bad qualities and avoid them. So this means that nobody is perfect, and yet everybody has something we can learn from. And that's the idea of equal treatment among friends. However, the recommendation of circle of friends in this chapter simply means that we should keep a watchful eye on the influence that our friends have on our mentality and morality, and make sure that we are vigilant about our moral development. And because we're not perfect, and we tend to be influenced by our surroundings, so we should be selective and responsible when choosing friends. The governing principle make the circle of friends one of the observations because we can tell a lot about a person by looking at his or her circle of friends. And this is a natural deduction from the theory we discussed earlier. Now, one implication of this observation is that we can form a reasonable expectation about a person's future development. For example, the Lu Shi's commentary of the Spring and Autumn Record shows that there is an interesting story about a fortune teller in the state of Chu. The fortune teller was very well known because his prediction of a person's future was accurate. So this drew the curiosity of King Zhuang, the King Zhuang of Chu, and he went to pay a visit. And the fortune teller revealed to the king that, in fact, his prediction actually came from his observation of the subject's circle of friends. Okay, he said, for a common person, he would observe the human relation of the subject's friends. Remember, not the human relation of the subject himself, okay, but the subject's friends. So if the subject's friends are filial to their parents, if they can maintain a good relationship with the siblings, if they can respect the senior, also prudence and respect the law, then the fortune teller would reach a conclusion that the subject's family would become more harmonious day by day, and the subject would become healthy. This is because the subject witness how to achieve family harmony. Even if his family is not harmonious at the moment, it is very likely that he can pick up something very useful from his friends and improve his own situation accordingly. So this is in fact very straightforward. Now, when the subject is a government official, the fortune teller said he would check whether or not the subject's friends are loyal, trustworthy, and prefer ethics and virtue. If this is the case, then the fortune teller would reach a conclusion that the subject's relationship with his leader would be improved. Also, there would be outstanding professional contribution and promotion. This is because loyal, trustworthiness, and virtue are the foundation of government work. And a person's technical skill is only secondary to those personal traits. Now, when the subject is the leader himself, the focus is on the ethical performance of the subject's close subordinates. subordinates. If the subordinates practice virtue, they are loyal and righteous, and they're able to point out the leader's mistake, then it can be expected that the country will become prosperous in the foreseeable future. And the subject himself would also receive more respect day by day. So I think at this stage, I would like to pause for a minute and reflect upon our own common perception about a country or company. So what do I mean by that? You see, when we look at a country, right, and make comment about the country's future, there is only a limited number of boxes to tick. Its economic development, political structure, and its technology, etc. Well, yes, they are important, but they're only part of the story. The future of a country is closely related to the ethical standard of the government officials and the interaction among them. If the officials are only motivated by narrow agendas such as personal career and short-term economic target, then the entire government will be driven by short-termism. Likewise, a company that advocates for employee ethics, long-term thinking, customer satisfaction, and a good leader-employee relation will perform far better than companies that focus only on quarterly earnings or beating the analyst's short-term forecast and monthly league tables and so on. So coming back to our discussion, another application of observing the circle of friends is related to self-reflection. The Book of Changes said, notes of the same key respond to one another. Creatures of the same nature seek one another. So this means that the characteristics of circle of friends, in fact, to some degree, reflect our own characteristics. Friends affect us, but we also seek for the same type of people unconsciously. A simple example, if we put a hard-working person with a lazy person, and put them together, they probably won't have a lot to talk about, right? Because, they find it uncomfortable with each other. So naturally, we would prefer to make friends with someone with similar characteristics. Therefore, we can say that the formation of the circle of friends is a two-way thing. If we realize that there is something wrong with our circle of friends, perhaps it is a good idea to start reflecting upon ourselves first. Now, the next, the fifth point of observation is the official's practice of virtue. Well, the observation of practice of virtue is slightly different from the observation of behavior because it requires the observer to be more specific, more specific about the quality of the candidate. Now, for this chapter, we use the framework provided by the governing principles called the situational test. Situational tests. Now, the situational test sounds very much like the aptitude test that companies use today during the recruitment process. And the difference is that these situational tests are virtue-focused and real-time, a bit like reality TV show where you can tell a lot about the person in the show. So the situational test tests for 6 qualities. 6 qualities, namely benevolence, righteousness, loyalty, trustworthiness, courage, and intelligence. Now, I believe our viewers should now be quite familiar with these concepts from our earlier lectures, and because of time constraint, we will not repeat them, the meaning here. So if you only started watching our lectures from halfway, it shouldn't matter too much, but I would like to recommend you to have a look at our earlier lectures where, we discuss important basic concepts at your convenience. Okay, but what I do like to emphasize here is that is the sequence of these tests The sequence matters. A candidate must show a benevolent heart and righteous mind first, and then loyalty and trustworthiness, before demonstrating his mind of courageous and technical know-how. Now, this is simply because a highly intelligent person without a benevolent heart or the ability to distinguish between right and wrong can pose a significant threat to the security of the society. So let's have a look at these tests. Now, as the name suggests, in a situational test, the subject is put in a situation where he has to respond to certain changes in social parameters, and subsequently the quality of the response of the subject is evaluated. Now, the situation is, of course, not a unique one, and there can be multiple scenarios for testing the same quality. But we think that the particular situation described in the governing principles are very effective in teasing out the respective virtue. So, the test of benevolence says that make a person wealthy and see if he breaks propriety and or the law. Why is that? Well, from the previous lectures, we know that benevolence is about mutuality. The Chinese character of benevolence describes two persons. So benevolence means the keeping other people in mind. If there's something we don't like, we also do not impose it on other people. So that's the basic concept of benevolence. So this is put in the first order, right? Because it simply solves many of the world conflicts, if not all of them. All the wars and crimes share one thing in common, which is one-way thinking. You see, those who commit a crime or start a war do not want to be on the opposite side, right? So in other words, for them, it is okay to commit a crime or start a war, but it's not okay if they become the recipient of the same crime or the same war. And similarly, people, obey social propriety and law because they know that it is good for other people and themselves. Even if they don't think about other people, they still obey social propriety and law because they don't want to be punished. Now, what happens when people become wealthy and powerful? Well, for some people, they will start having this idea that, their wealth and power can somehow protect them from being punished for wrongdoing. And in some cases, they can indeed get away with crime. So this is where the test comes in. If they choose to obey social propriety and law, even if they can theoretically shield themselves from punishment for committing a crime, they must have some moral constraint, wouldn't they? They must have had other people in mind and been able to stand in the shoes of others and limit their own action. And this is benevolence. Now, in a modern society, the system of law is relatively stringent, and I suppose there's limited loopholes to exploit. So in this test, it is probably more effective to observe how a wealthy person maintains social propriety, because it requires voluntary compliance. Another point to make about this test is that it recommends a proactive setting of the situation. You see, remember what it says, make a person wealthy. Although, in theory, it would be very convenient, for the assessor to be able to set up in a situation by giving the subject a lot of money, but in practice, it is certainly not very easy to do so. However, we can definitely understand the essence of the test and make adequate observation. For instance, if a person changes his behavior from self-discipline to reckless after getting a promotion or receiving a fat bonus, then we know that his benevolence is not up to the standard. Okay, so that's the first test. The second test makes a person honored and see if he has pride. So pride may not be as visible as social propriety and law. It's a type of attitude towards the others, and the attitude may be easily influenced by a person's social position. A righteous person is able to maintain the correct attitude under all circumstances. For example, being humble or being respectful to the virtuous, etc. So the leader can test a candidate's righteousness by giving him or her a high position and observing the consistency of his attitude. The third test says, grant a person authority and see if he becomes imperious. And this is a test of loyalty. Okay, this is easy to understand. A loyal person is simply loyal at all times. Loyalty is loyalty. And he must abide by the spirit and a command of his superior and work within his scope of power. So if a person is not so loyal, then when he is granted with higher authority, he may start expanding his scope of activity and no longer abide by the command of the superior. Interestingly, in Chinese language, we have a very funny description about this type of person, which says he's forgotten his last name, which basically means that he forgot where he came from. Right? And there's another one that says he cannot find north. He cannot find north, which means that he's probably become dizzy with the power and success. Okay, no, probably doesn't sound as funny in English, but you get the idea. And there are some other ones which we're not going to go there today. Now, the fourth test says, give a person tasks and see if he hides things. So this is a test of trustworthiness. And I think the main point about this test is that the leader must have the full knowledge and information of the task, so that he's able to determine whether the candidate hides any information. And this test may be particularly useful if the test provides potential self-benefit, in other words, an opportunity of corruption. Now, the last two tests says, put a person in a difficult situation and see if he remains calm, and ask a person to deal with urgent issues and see if he solves problems well. So they test the test for the quality of courage and intelligence. Now these two don't require the same level of explanation, but I guess the point is that the tests are only effective when the candidate is under pressure, under stress, and we can call it a stress test if you like, because without pressure and an acute situation, it's difficult to distinguish an excellent official from a mediocre official. Now, the sixth point of observation is about the treacherous side of the official. Now, this is not to assume that everybody, must have a treacherous side. It simply prevents the government from recruiting treacherous officials. So, what does treacherous mean anyway? What do we mean by that? Well, a treacherous person simply doesn't speak his mind. Okay, he decorates his words and actions to achieve certain private agenda at the expense of public interest. Volume 40 of the Governing Principles define this kind of official as follows. It says, a treacherous minister goes with the leader's liking in order to win his trust and preference. For the things that are disliked by the leader, he condemns indiscriminately. So we have learnt about the problem of treacherous officials in many occasions in our course so far, and we have emphasized that the source of treacherous official is, remember, what is that? The source of treacherous officials is the leader, right? If the leader likes to hear nice words and disregard tough advice, then treacherous officials will be favored. In this section, we just want to illustrate the bad consequence of having a treacherous officials with the story of Mr. Tian Ba, okay, Tian Ba, which is recorded in the book of Xin Xu. So, here it is. Now, Mr. Tian Ba lived in the state of Qi. Okay, so there's a lot of story about the state of Qi, and he was well known for his virtue and self-cultivation. The king of Qi also heard about his talent and summoned him to the palace to discuss governance and politics. So before he left home, Mr. Tianba put on new clothes, tidy up his hair, tighten his sash, and asked his concubine, "Oh, what do you think? What do you think?" So his concubine replied, "Oh, you are very handsome." And as Mr. Tianba was walking through the gate, right before he left, he asked his servant, "What do you think?" His servant said, "Very good, sir." But as he walked past a lake, and looked at his reflection, he realized he looked shockingly ugly. But this event had a big impact on Mr. Tianba's self-realization. So when he sat down with the king and discussed about governance, he said, "My lord, the key of good governance is the leader himself. Only with upright behavior himself can the leader influence the officials around him. You see, before I left home today, I asked my concubine about my appearance. Now, because of her love to me, she praised my look to please me. I also asked my servant about my look. Because my servant fears me, he also praised my look. But when I saw myself in the reflection of the lake, I came to realize how ugly I look. My lord, I'm afraid that there are far more flattering people around you than just 2 or 3. If you can review yourself in the reflection and see through your own mistake and change it immediately, our country will achieve greatness very soon." Wow, I think this, I love this. I think this is a very meaningful story. And I shall check my look immediately after this video. You see, the leader of a country must be aware of the deceitful and treacherous officials around him and be critical about their compliment. Without vigilance, these compliments can confuse the leader's judgment and lead to devastating consequences in governance. Meanwhile, this story shows that the most effective defense mechanism for the leader is to be upright and self-criticize, so that he or she can maintain a neutral mindset and clear judgment. Now, the 7th point of observation is about the heart of the official. The heart of the official. Okay, now this part of observational skill is more about the method of observation itself. Okay, the method of observation. And it emphasizes that the observer should see through the external representation of a person and form a good understanding of mental activity. And this applies to just about all the observations that we have discussed. For example, as we said before, when the observer listens to the candidate talking, the way that he or she talks can show his or her mentality, right? When the candidate makes a complaint or express a negative view, a benevolent person may choose his words cautiously and minimize the harm. And this shows that he is very considerate, instead of single-mindedly casting harsh comment, which may lead to unintended consequences. Now, we want to discuss another side of the observation of the heart, okay? And it is the question of, what do the candidates see? What do the candidates see? This is to say that people see what they want to see. Okay? For the same phenomenon, different people may have polarized views. Sometimes it is because of different information set of the observers, but sometimes it's because of different mentality. The former, different information set is easier to tackle, but the latter is more subtle and deceiving. In the collection of aphorisms of Venerable Master Hong Yi, it explains that a person's internal characteristics have a sizable impact or influence on where he focuses when he makes evaluation or interpretation of a situation. So if a person is a benevolent and modest person, he tends to be calm in the mind and less demanding on people. And this makes him able to see the good side in people. But this is not to say that he cannot see the downside, right? But at least he doesn't ignore the upside. That's the idea. So when he makes a comment, he tends to speak about the positive side and show more kindness. But in contrast, a less benevolent person tends to be more demanding on others. So when the situation is different from his expectation, the first response is negative. And he focuses more on the downside. And this leads to more negative comments, and he may also appear arrogant. For example, let's imagine a situation where people make comments about a person who helps a blind person cross the street. We've seen that at some point, right? Now, there are some good comments. Well, this person is selfless. He's so warm-hearted and considerate, etc. But there are also potentially some bad comments too. Well, he's just showing off. He's being nosy or something like that. Now, our viewers may argue that rational people would not make that kind of polarized comment, would they? Well, that's my hope as well. But unfortunately, people are simply not rational enough. And we do observe some, repeated patterns in certain people who always make very similar comments regardless of the situation. In our example, even if the person is indeed showing off his kindness, a positive person may still be able to see the merit in the action. A kind act would always have a positive influence over the rest of the society. So, why not? So the conclusion is, when the leader makes observation about the candidate, it may be useful to create a scenario where the candidate has to make comments about certain phenomenon and observe his focus of attention from his response. So that's about the heart. The final observation is, again, about the general methodology of observation, and that is the so-called comprehensive review. Okay, comprehensive review. So this means that the observer should not, rush out a partial conclusion based on incomplete review. Well, this is common sense, right? This is common sense. But because the observer is always, subject to human flaws, the conclusion may be biased based on personal belief, reasoned experience, or hearsays. So it is necessary to have some kind of checklist when making observations. The governing principle have provided a very comprehensive checklist for observational purpose, and it includes many important points that we have mentioned in this lecture. Generally, the list is consisted of two parts. Okay, one is the topic of the topic of investigation, and the other is the corresponding recommended action. The topic of investigation is consisted of four types. Okay, four types, namely the candidate's personal status, his human relations, his social situations, and finally, his emotional situation. For example, when a person is poor, investigate his virtue. which means that whether or not he can maintain his integrity. When a person is young, investigate his manner to the senior and elderly. For his relationship with the siblings, investigate whether he loves them. And for a situation where he is confronted with personal gain, investigate whether or not he can hold his ground and keep greed under control. So we're not going to go through all of these points. Many of them are repeated, but it's worthwhile to emphasize again that when making a conclusion about a candidate, the observer should stick to the checklist and hold on to conclusion and make the investigation as comprehensive as possible. I guess the better the investigation, the better the government can understand the candidate and better the utility of human resource and better it is for the people. So this concludes Lecture 6. Thank you.